Hi everyone, welcome to Dan Golant Days, New York City 2023. It's just really funny to have this slide up here while Stefana announces everything, but I hope you enjoyed staring at me for, I don't know, 5 minutes. Like I said, my name is Dan Golant. I'm an engineer based here in New York City, and I am really excited to present to you Who Owns What? Building Ownership Culture While Blitzscaling. This talk is based in my experiences working at a incredibly fast-growing startup based here in New York City, and the experiences I gained and some things we built along the way working on incident response, observability, reliability, and ownership culture. So let's set the scene a little bit. You work at a hot Series C startup. The workforce in engineering is growing roughly 10% every month. The business overall is growing like 12x a year. You're reorging every other Friday, and you're all working just a little bit too hard. Engineering labor breaks down in roughly the following way. On the left here, in these orange shaded boxes, you see folks working in microservices. They're pretty happy, they're having a good time, they're neatly organized, and they're generally doing pretty well, right? Another 40% of your organization works inside your majestic monolith. It is on the right in blue, which you probably can't see very well, but you can see that everyone, the monolith is well designed, it's working pretty well for us, it's driving a ton of our business, but when it comes to observability, reliability, things like that, things are a little bit jumbled up, and it leaves people with a feeling of, maybe a little bit meh, right? We'll be focusing mostly on this latter group, but I shouldn't forget that a remaining 20% of your organization works in things like infrastructure and platform and other miscellaneous things, and they're not pictured because I guess no one cares about how they feel about all this. On some regular cadence, your organization comes together to respond to incidents and review them. It's a little bit too frequent on both fronts. And one question that keeps coming up in these reviews, but also in the incidents themselves is, who owns this damn thing, right? So for that latter group that we saw on the right, who are all a little bit jumbled up and a little meh, writing code is pretty easy. Your monolith has a ton of reusable code, things are going great, right? But the people writing that code, when it comes to operating and being on call and knowing whether their software is working, they're simply not aware that the flows that they maintain are failing, or that, BizOps, who depend on the tools that they build, their efficiency is dropping off, and we don't know until support comes and tells us, right? Or we're totally missing any indication that, async tasks are failing until it starts to take down the entire queue that they're on, threatens the overall system, and someone from the platform, by the way, you work on the platform team and no one cares about your feelings, and you're gonna come in pretty upset when the queue goes down because one task is failing, right? Also, all pages by default eventually bubble up to you, whether in defaults in the system or because no one answered them for 3 hours and everything is breaking, right? So why are we not getting all of these valuable signals, right? These metrics, these traces, these logs, these alerts. Why are we not getting signals to the correct people? Well, let's take a look at how our signal routing is set up. I'll be using the word signal to encapsulate sort of like metrics, traces, logs, alerts, etc. So if you hear me say signals, that's what I mean. In microservices world, things are honestly pretty good, right? You have a single service owner marked in the Terraform that defines the service, right? And we emit base instrumentation on things like HTTP, database calls, state transitions, et cetera, et cetera. And because there's only one owner, we know where those things go, right? Very easy. And like I said, we're reorging, every 30 minutes. And so when you need to hand over your service to a new team that your team was like sort of butted into, right? Or another team because we changed the ownership scope, you just have to go into that Terraform file and mark a new GitHub team as the owner, and things automatically route themselves. Things are pretty serviceable. In monolith world, as you might imagine, because it's the focus of this talk, things are a little rougher. I won't go into, real detail here because, for context, my notes have about 12 slides, 12 bullets here. But every team, has to set up like 3, escalation terraforms, a fake service terraform because our alerting vendor assumes that each service has one owner. Then you need to go instrument every call site, and very quickly, instrumenting just new code starts to look a little bit like this. You get this giant ball of spaghetti where no one knows what's going on, and crucially too, when it's time to move signals over, no one knows, no one knows or has the time while they're writing features to move that over. So what's the outcome here? The cognitive load for just net new work, new features, is pretty high, right? If you're establishing a new team, you need to go do those 15 steps I just talked about. There's markedly less instrumentation on new code, but critically old code that just keeps getting hot potatoed to teams left and right. That's becoming less and less well instrumented as it's becoming less and less well understood because your organization is growing, new people are coming in, right? Additionally, the drift between current ownership and where alerts actually get sent is increasing over time because this process is difficult, people never do it, and so we just don't know who owns what, as I've said. And again, your platform team, your infrastructure team is acting as the safety net for team-specific issues, and they're slowly getting burnt out and frustrated. And then at the 15th incident review this month, someone asks, who owns this damn thing? But this time around, it's someone with like a serious title, right? Someone with a lot of reports, and they say, this is our 3rd issue with just this package in the monolith this month. Who owns this damn thing? And then, after digging through Confluence, finding like 6 deprecated docs, we find who technically currently owns this thing, and the excuses start, right? Well, we own this thing, but we don't have the resources to instrument it, which is valid. Or technically we own this thing, but it was never handed over to us properly, which is, in my opinion, a little less valid. Or, we own this thing, but listen to how good my excuse is. You should just give me a pass, right? It's at this point that, frustration peaks its head because, engineers are sitting in these meetings and they're watching managers offer up these, explanations, and they're watching, VPs, managers of managers, accept these, explanations. And then maybe they're starting to think that, engineers are being held to higher standards than maybe management is. And that frustration starts to grow. And that's critical to mention because not only is this dangerous to your system, it's dangerous to your culture. And as frustration boils over, you hear the dreaded A word. I just want to take a moment to say I'm not a huge fan of the frequency with which and the way in which I hear accountability culture talked about. Once we're talking about accountability, things have gone off the rails already generally. It's purely concerned with consequences, negative consequences. No one talks about, who's accountable for this when it's time for a raise or a promotion or a delicious pint of ice cream, right? It's only when it's bad. Also, there's like an external locus of control. Someone decides to hold you accountable. We should be holding ourselves accountable, but that's not how I see it play out, honestly. And it happens regardless of how empowered you are. It almost encourages you to just focus on your lane and care about what you'll be accountable for later, right? We have a better tool here, right? And that's ownership culture. This is in Rainbow, happy Pride Month. And it's a better way, right? It's in Rainbow because I think it's so important, and I love it. Ownership culture starts from a mission, and it lets people figure out everything between the starting point and getting to the end of the mission, right? Architecture, vendors, deploy schedules, on-call policies, what have you, right? It's proactive, it's forward-looking, right? It's how do we accomplish the mission? It's anti-learned helplessness, it encourages people to take ownership, and critically, there's an internal locus of control, right? I don't want to recap everything anyone's ever written about ownership culture, but the point is that before we talk about who's accountable, we first need to establish who owns what. So let's state our problem a little more concretely. Currently, inside our monolith, our majestic monolith, it's too hard to create alerts that reach the correct owners. Moreover, we don't even have a stable source of truth that we all agree on for who the correct owner is, right? We have to dig through Confluence, find a document that went stale 6 months ago, and figure out the diff to the truth, right? Additionally, developers need to set things up correctly in 3+ places just in order to start routing their alerts to the correct place. And then once they get it to the correct place, when we have a reorg, 30 seconds from now, they need to rewire all of that. The reorgs are getting faster and faster, if you haven't noticed. Well, in my opinion, as with many problems in engineering, it's good to start with the source of truth. If you don't have a source of truth, you're in big trouble, so let's start there. What's the source of truth on who owns something? Well, in a business, who owns something, it's who is responsible for the business process, right? And in a software business, the business process is often defined by the software. So we have kind of a hunch that the owner of the business process is who owns the code, right? So we have a hunch. Who owns the code? Well, whoever's working on it, right? And you might say, well, let's go look at GitHub diffs and just do some analysis, right? It's a little dangerous, right? I might own something and you need it changed and I'm busy. And so, I'm approving the changes, but you're the most recent contributor, right? And so we need to be careful here, but at least now we have a hunch, which is that ownership is not some document in Confluence. Sorry to keep bragging on Confluence, it's great. But it's who is responsible for the code, which is roughly equivalent to who is responsible for the business process. But wait, we have a tool to know who is responsible for the code. We have a policy internally, right? It's code owners MD. We have a policy that every file must be owned, and ownership of a file comes with the privilege of, or the responsibility of setting the review policy, right? Deciding, how many reviews you need, from whom, et cetera, et cetera. Reviewing a bunch of files is a little bit of a drag, but that comes with the privilege of not being paged in the middle of the night because someone on another team silently merged changes to your code and blew it up, right? So you see that there's this interplay of responsibility and privilege where being a better owner gives you what I would say is slightly better observability in the sense of less noise, right? And you might say, wait, code owners can go stale just like a doc in Confluence could, right? People just click approve, they never update it, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's a problem, I agree, but I would say that it's better than having, 6 implicitly deprecated org chart docs as your source of truth. So let's maybe for now say this problem is handled, right? But we still have these 4 other problems. It's too hard to create alerts that reach the correct owner. Developers need to do a whole bunch of nonsense just to receive the signals, and when the who changes, you're in trouble. But we have a source of truth, and that's really powerful, right? So what can we do with that source of truth? Well, if I was infinitely fast, if I was one of those aliens from Men in Black with the million arms, and I could move really quickly, I could just continue what I'm doing right now. I receive the page on the platform team, I go look at the metric, find it in the code base, look up who owns that file, and go manually route it, right? And then the problem would be solved. But we have a problem here of speed and sequence, right? And at least now we have a source of truth, so we know that a person can go into the code owner's file and figure out who owns the process. But powerfully here, the code owner's file, as opposed to some document, it's text in the code base, right? And you can do something with text in the code base, right? We could automate receiving the signal, reversing the lookup to where it came from, and looking up the code owner. But the file's already there in the code base with the producer of the signal. So what if we could just write a piece of code who asks, who owns me? Well, then it could just route its own alerts, right? And that's what we did with a thing we called callable code owners. If you take one thing away from this talk, it's the following. We take the ownership and we put it on the disk. How did we do that? Thank you. This was the hardest slide on this. How did we do that? Well, it looks a little bit like the following. I'll say right off the bat that we did not use CodeOwnersMD, the GitHub tool, for a variety of reasons, but we did have a rule now that every team needed to have a YAML file dictating what they own, and every file must be owned, as you see on the left here. There's a roughly delineated checkout module that that entry on line 4 and line 10 doesn't really matter. It's the fact that those files are owned by me that matters, right? And we're already, because we're not using CodeOwnersMD, we're already running a GitHub action to check that any file changed is owned in an index, right? So to that action, what we just added was taking the index we build, inverting it so that the key is the file path blob and the value is the team, and then we just loaded it onto the container. And then we exposed an API in the code. You'll see it on line 14 here. It says owner::getOwner with argument file path. The file path is a constant in Node. You can get it in Python. You can get it in Ruby. And we made it available to developers so that for any metric they wanted to produce or get alerted on, they just own an owner. They just add an owner tag. And if the service equals monolith and the owner equals team A receives that alert. So for any alert that hits our alerting vendor with this owner tag, it gets routed to you. Critically, we could have just hard-coded this with owner::team A. In fact, that's what our original solution was. But it leads to the problem of updating 1 million call sites, right? Here, you just update one file. So we've eliminated a second problem. Developers need to set things up correctly in 3+ places, right? We've gotten rid of that. You just have to set ownership in one place, and now alert routing is free. Personally, when we actually rolled this out, this was huge, right? This was actually a huge development. But we have 2 remaining original problems: migration and staying current, both the active migration and making sure our data source stays current. Additionally, I'll add one thing, which is that even if we achieve our original 4 goals, developers still have to write a bunch of sloggy instrumentation that you would get free in a service. So if we really want to deliver transformational change, we need to tackle that, right? Let's keep going. So migration is now also super simple. Let's say we have team A on the left and team B on the right, and they're YAML ownership. Team A is responsible for checkout and cart management, and team B is responsible for unicorns and rainbows, and we want to move checkout to team B. To migrate ownership, you just move the files over, like so. And now, anytime after the container restarts, anytime that getOwner function we saw gets called, the function will return back team B instead of team A and start routing all alerts and all metrics to team B instead, meaning migration is now basically free, which is great. That giant ball of spaghetti we saw earlier, it's basically, yeeted, right? Like, we've gotten rid of it. And that's pretty amazing, but I'm not sure that we can solve these remaining 2 problems, right? How do we make sure that the data source stays current? And, and even then, you still have to write all this instrumentation. We've made good alerting a lot easier, but we haven't made it totally free. And it doesn't, bend towards correctness. And that's a bit sad. Oh well, time to go home. I just want to pause for a second and say this clip art whale that I found just looks absolutely despondent, and it's kind of heartbreaking. This really broke my heart when I saw it for the first time, but I guess there's nothing we can... No. I will not disappoint a whale. Not again. We need to think. Is there a way that our final 2 problems actually kind of solve each other, right? We introduced this sloggy instrumentation problem because we realized it while we were building this tool, right? But in the extra problem, we actually found a solution to our first problem. So let's think about how we can tackle that extra problem of sloggy instrumentation. And let's go back to our code. Now, you see at the top we have a function that's called getWeather, and then underneath it has a function called get. They're in one file for the sake of showing you one small file, but you'll notice that the module is called http.ts. So technically, getWeather should be somewhere else. Well, what if we took that getOwner function, and instead of just making it optional to pass into metric calls, we made it mandatory that you pass a file name to every core library, right? Then we could attach an owner metric to an owner tag to every metric being emitted from any of our core libraries, right? That means for a significant portion of our operations, things like HTTP, database calls, state transitions in our system. They don't even have to write the instrumentation anymore. They're already passing the file name, the metric self-tag, and you just need to write alerting. Now you just have to write the alert. We've kind of deleted a bunch of sloggy instrumentation. But actually, do you have to write the alert? Well, all of our services already generate standard monitors that come with them. And the problem was that in our monolith, you can't just route by the service tag. We would break down by the URL, as you see on line 16, but you couldn't route to the correct owner. Well, if we just break down by the owner using like a Datadog multi-alert, then for each outbound request, rather than just routing to one owner, we could say for each outbound request, route to the correct owner and alert based on the URL, but give it to one person, right? Or one team, rather. Wow, so we've deleted HTTP latency alerts as a problem that people need to manually instrument. If you just repeat that for every golden signal for HTTP, and then repeat that process for every significant operation, database calls in queues, things like that we care about, well, now you have free alerts inside one service that you could normally only get inside, with a microservice. We now have free alerts. Any new feature launched will default to having good coverage. So we've deleted 4 of our now 5 problems. We've reduced the need to manually instrument. Our alerts are self-routing. They're easy to migrate. And we've given people a bunch of free alerts. This is super powerful. And if we're being fair to ourselves, we've also kind of deleted the first half of bullet 1, right? It's pretty easy to route to the correct owner. It's just it might go stale, which is a problem, right? People don't update the code owner's file necessarily. Except, do you see that we might have created kind of a virtuous cycle? Through bullet 5, I want to be clear. Before, if I'm a code owner and I'm just kind of rubber stamping reviews and someone tells me like, you don't own this thing anymore, changing even one file, it's kind of a pain. I got things to do, right? So I'm just going to keep rubber stamping, right? And it costs me nothing because all of my alerts are going to the platform team. And again, no one cares about their feelings. I was on the platform team, to be clear, which is why I'm a little bitter. But now, we have free alerting for any HTTP call you own, any database call, and your routing mechanism for even your custom metrics is owner-based. So if you're just kind of like green-lighting any change to your files, right, you're now feeling that friction, that pain of receiving alerts for bad code. And so now, it's not zero friction to just rubber stamp things and never update it. When you no longer own something, you're going to pass it off. You don't want those alerts anymore. You don't want that responsibility, right? And so we've solved our last problem, right? We've hit all of our requirements, which I feel in software engineering is a feat in itself, considering we accepted some scope creep. But now we have this virtuous cycle, and success. We've solved all of our problems. But have we built maybe something new? We called this ownership-driven observability, and it highlighted a very interesting relationship to me. Critically, we started giving teams tools for good ownership inside a monolith for free. Ownership is a privilege and a responsibility, but we also shouldn't leave you high and dry when we hand you something that we think is important, right? This is a team. We should empower each other. Well, in this world, whoever gets paged owns it, and if you don't want to own it, give it to someone who'll handle the page, right? So what was the impact of this when we rolled it out? First off, every new HTTP call, whatever, database call, as I've mentioned many times now, got free alerts. As a bonus, we were actually able to set up free per team dashboards that you would normally only get in a microservice, right? Before anything has gone wrong, an interested third party can look at a metric, see that it's spiking, check who the owner is, and let them know even, right, if they're just curious, right? This led to a double-digit percentage improvement in mean time to detect, and critically, I was just looking, at a teammate's resume the other day, and he pointed out that it actually led to like an over 100% increase in our automatic detection of things that would have otherwise been manually detected as incidents, right? Now, that came with some false positives because you're just alerting people on every standard signal now where they previously weren't. But in my book, that was also a win. We made it easy to turn off, and critically, the list of exclusions from standard alerting became a starting point to get teams on the path to SLOs. The first way, in my opinion, that you figure out what you care about is making a list, preferably in the code base, of things that you don't care about, right? And it put those teams on that path. Multiple prod-threatening bugs were caught in staging, and when I say multiple, it's like a number higher than you're thinking. I got many DMs from managers saying, hey, we had an inexperienced engineer with not a lot of time, launching something this week. They didn't write any instrumentation, and this would have been really bad if it got to production, but we caught it in staging thanks to these tools. The coolest thing for me was that I was able to make a dashboard that showed every VP, every team that they were over, everything that that team owned, right? Every HTTP call, et cetera. And it helped me with my argument that while we were decomposing out of the monolith, we were actually hiring into it faster and building new features into it faster, which we previously hadn't known. We got this crazy sort of top-down org visibility that we previously hadn't had. But more critically, what it taught me was there's a really powerful relationship between ownership and observability. We call this ownership-driven observability, but we could have just as easily called it observability-driven ownership, right? It reifies this relationship that I think a lot of people suspect it exists, which is that good ownership enables good observability, which in turn enables more good ownership. This is kind of this like philosophical thing, right? But improvements in infrastructure as code actually made it possible for us to leverage that like philosophical lever to create tools, which I think is really cool. Moreover, though, is there maybe a relationship between good ownership and good ops and good infrastructure and good architecture? Anecdotally, I'll say this. We had a single queue that these 25 teams were using, and we needed to decompose it because if team A has a task that backs up, we can't let it threaten most of our business. Well, once we had that callable code owner thing, we talked about putting every team in its own queue and letting them deal with backups as they will. We'll still help them, but now they're not threatening all of our other customers, right? That's clearly a risky move. We had a lot of risky ideas with this tool. It's like Conway's Law for your deployments. But in my mind, it informs us that there's also this circular relationship between good ops and good ownership, not just good observability and good ownership. And I wonder if there's a way to build more tools by reifying this relationship, because to me, it speaks to the core of the DevOps philosophy that we've all spent a bunch of time talking about, which is that good ops, in my opinion, and good ownership converge in terms of what they look like. It's giving the people with the most context the best control over how things work with as little friction as possible, and creating a great product, a great culture, and a great organization out of it. Thank you. I know that was a lot. I appreciate you all attending and walking through it with me. Again, these are some places you can find me. My name is Dan Golant. If you want to connect on LinkedIn, let me know. My blog is thelog.farm. I'm a log farmer. Yeah, thank you again.